Okay, let's take a look at how some great paintings are applying this 5-value system. Now brace yourself, because up to this point we've been dealing with very simple geometric forms, but we're going to dive right into the other end of the spectrum with complex forms. This is a close-up of the head of Lady Agnew, one of Sargent's most beautiful paintings. And as it transitions to values only, I think we can all be a little bit daunted by how subtle those value shifts are. But I'm going to show you where those 5 values are located in this portrait. Following our previous method, the first step is identifying where the light source is coming from. And in this case, it's coming from behind us, slightly to the left. This is probably a window in Sargent's studio. As you'll recall, the next step in our process is to identify where the light and shadow families live and draw the fence between them. Now, this is a much more difficult task here than in the sphere example, because the forms are so soft and subtle. But what we have to do to achieve this is pretend like there are no soft edges and make everything hard. Now, of course, Photoshop can help us here. Here is the same image with contrast bumped way up, as well as a subtle bit of dry brush applied. This turns all the edges slightly harder and actually gets rid of a lot of subtlety, which is exactly what we need for this task. And you'll see some simple shapes of light and shadow coming through. So let's go back to the original now, and using the previous image as a guide, here is where I think the light and shadow separate. Now, the thing to notice here is how simple, and hence beautiful, those shapes of shadow are. John Singer Sargent was a master draftsman, and part of what makes someone a master is being able to keep a whole lot of shapes very simple. Okay, the next thing I want to do is sample the painting and determine what my 5 values are. So I've done that ahead of time. Here's my chart. And the thing to notice about this is, look how close the light and shadow values are. Unlike our sphere example, it's not like this wide gap from light to shadow. In this case, things are very tight, pushed right up against each other. This is another reason why Sargent was so good. He could handle very subtle changes of value. Let's remember our painting rule about how lights can never be darker than shadows, and shadows can never be lighter than lights. Well, Sargent is still following that rule, even though he's pushing it right to its limit, and I'll show you what I mean. Here is a look at what the darkest value in the light, which is the halftone, this is a look at what that value is. Compare that to the lightest value in the shadow, which is the reflected light, and you can see there's only a 6-point separation there, but that's still something. So getting back to our breakdown, average shadow is a good place to start because it clearly shows the fence line between light and shadow families. And as you remember from the sphere example, we just started by painting our average shadow and average light to get us a basic starting point. Also notice that included in the shadow, I've grouped in things that are just naturally dark, like the eyebrows and the irises themselves. Now, this is something called local value, which I'm going to talk about in the next section. But just for now, I generally do group naturally dark things in with the shadow. Okay, our next step, let's go back into the light family and look at the halftones. Now remember what I said before, halftones are the hardest value to paint, and indeed halftones in this painting are incredibly subtle and beautiful. But they are there and they are making very noticeable, beautifully simple designed shapes. Now in the sphere example, I said that halftones are responsible for the bridge from light to shadow, and that's always true for primitives. But for complex forms like a portrait, halftones don't always have to bridge to shadow. Halftones are applied wherever the form is turning away from the light. Now, you guys can clearly see that this is far more complex than just a simple sphere, right? But don't worry, I will be doing a portrait demonstration later where I will be painting these halftones so you can see how they're applied from scratch. But let's look at these for now. Some of these halftones are responsible for bridging light into shadow, just like we saw with our sphere, while other halftones do not. Other halftones are there simply because the form is turning away from the light, but then it transitions back into average light or even highlight. It's all dictated by the form interacting with the light direction. So here are the halftones that transition light into shadow, meaning on the left side of those shapes is the light family, and on the right side of those shapes is the shadow family. And I want you guys to really study this when it's side by side. Take a look at the halftone shapes I've highlighted, and now look at the original portrait and see if you can spot how those halftones are getting slightly darker values than the average light. And notice how subtly it's turning the form. Pause the video if you have to. Okay, I just want to remind you that this is a very advanced painting, guys. It's going to get simpler from here. So let's soldier on. Let's take a look at an easy value now, the highlights. Here are all the highlights. Now remember, highlights are a direct reflection of the light source, and usually they occur where two planes meet. The more you study the human form, the more you can actually predict where these highlights are going to show up, because it's where two planes are coming together. Okay, last but not least, we have our final value in the shadow, reflected light. Now remember, reflected light is responsible for lightening the shadows just a little bit, and it's usually caused by bounce light or light coming from the sky. In this case, it's bounce light coming off the chest. And as we remember, bounce light is strongest where it's closest to the source of the bounce. In this case, it starts just underneath the chin and travels up to the right underneath the jaw. This is one of my favorite passages of reflected light in any painting. I love that shape. And the only other reflected light is the cast shadow from the head, getting some light probably bouncing off from the wall as that shadow tapers back into the light. Okay, and in closing, I want to remind you guys that every shape I just showed you, in every value, was simply designed and therefore beautiful. You can imagine how easy it would be to make this painting very ugly due to badly designed shapes. And you notice how Sargent has kept it so readable by keeping very simple shapes. Then the edges are the next layer on top of this, and we can obviously see that everything is quite soft in this painting. The hardest edge I can see is the highlight on the bridge of the nose. That has a fairly hard edge on it. And then going down to firm edges, maybe where the eyebrows transition back to the skin, those are firm edges. Underneath the eyelids, firm edge. And then in terms of soft edges, all of the halftones have varying degrees of soft edges. Now, the only lost edge I see in this entire portrait is actually where the shadow side of the hair transitions into the cast shadow on the wall. Now, we didn't talk about this area of the painting that much, but just in terms of edges, this is the only lost edge that I can see. Now, with that Sargent painting fresh in your mind, I want you to take a look at this painting by Skip Liepke. It's the exact same painting, just with a different model. Same light source, same light and shadow families, same basic areas of halftone, highlights, reflected lights. But the two main differences are, one, there's much more contrast between light and shadow, and two, there are harder edges. That makes this a little more obvious to break down. But I want you to take a minute and look at these two paintings and really try and understand how they are fundamentally the same thing. Okay, let's move on.